We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology. Carl Sagan. Happiness is dependent on self-discipline. We are the biggest obstacles to our own happiness. It is much easier to do battle with society and with others than to fight our own nature. Dennis Prager. Success is dependent on effort. Sophocles. History is dependent on the new generation to write a new chapter. LaMelo Ball. The best partnerships aren't dependent on a mere common goal but on a shared path of equality, desire, and no small amount of passion. Sarah McLean. The climate crisis is both the easiest and the hardest issue we have ever faced. The easiest because we know what we must do. We must stop the emissions of greenhouse gases. The hardest because our current economics are still totally dependent on burning fossil fuels, and thereby destroying ecosystems in order to create everlasting economic growth. Greta Thunberg. The world is getting smaller and smaller every day. We cannot find ourselves dependent on somebody who is untrustworthy. Wayne Rogers. All greatness of character is dependent on individuality. The man who has no other existence than that which he partakes in common with all around him, will never have any other than an existence of mediocrity. James Fenimore Cooper. Love is a state of being. Your love is not outside. It is deep within you. You can never lose it, and it cannot leave you. It is not dependent on some other body, some external form. Eckhart Tolle. My happiness is not dependent on others, it comes from within. Spiritual growth in a person is never encouraged, but it is important. I don't know why people want to judge others instead of doing their own thing. I firmly feel that I don't need to follow or live according to other people's rules. I like living life the way I want to. Sonu Nigam. Don't be dependent. At all. Ever. Period. Jordan Peterson. We humans have become dependent on plastic for a range of uses, from packaging to products. Reducing our use of plastic bags is an easy place to start getting our addiction under control. David Suzuki. The sun, with all those planets revolving around it and dependent on it, can still ripen a bunch of grapes as if it had nothing else in the universe to do. Galileo Galilei. We travel together, passengers on a little spaceship, dependent on its vulnerable reserves of air and soil, all committed, for our safety, to its security and peace. Preserved from annihilation only by the care, the work and the love we give our fragile craft. Adlai Stevenson. I strongly support the construction of the Keystone Pipeline and favor expanding offshore drilling to make our nation less dependent on foreign oil. Tom Tillis. People often talk about the self-driving car and what will that do? In 32 states, the number one job is to be the driver. But remember, it's not just the driver. Let's think about the truck stops along the way. When you suddenly have a lot of other people who are dependent on those careers. Julie Sweet. Monetary success is not success. Career success is not success. Life, someone that loves you, giving to others, doing something that makes you feel complete and full. That is success. And it isn't dependent on anyone else. James Avery. People with targets and jobs dependent upon meeting them will probably meet the targets, even if they have to destroy the enterprise to do it. W. Edwards Deming. I feel very lucky and privileged to be a writer. I feel lucky in the sense that I can branch out into prose and tell different kinds of stories and stuff. But being a writer is so great because you're literally not dependent on anybody. Sam Shepard. I decided that the stock market was not an option for IKEA. I knew that only a long-term perspective could secure our growth plans, and I didn't want IKEA to become dependent on financial institutions. Ingvar Kamprad. Identity is becoming more dependent on what people are willing to subscribe to and less dependent on objective criteria such as skin color or where they're born. Ways of identifying blackness are no longer black or white. It's not a case of us or them, you can now be us and them, like them but different. Stuart Hall. There will always be some who, for whatever reason, find themselves dependent on the charity of others. But when half the population is along for the ride, the system becomes dangerously out of balance. Things fall apart. Tucker Carlson. Welfare makes you dependent upon someone to take care of you. Charles Evers. Success is almost totally dependent upon drive and persistence. The extra energy required to make another effort or try another approach is the secret of winning. Dennis Waitley. Old friends die on you, and they're irreplaceable. You become dependent. Lionel Blue. All art is dependent on technology because it's a human endeavor, so even when you're using charcoal on a wall or design the proscenium arch, that's technology. George Lucas. We are 100% responsible for the pursuit of holiness, but at the same time we are 100% dependent upon the Holy Spirit to enable us in that pursuit. The pursuit of holiness is not a pull yourself up by your own bootstraps approach to the Christian life. Jerry Bridges. It is a fine thing to establish one's own religion in one's heart, not to be dependent on tradition and second-hand ideals. Life will seem to you, later, not a lesser, but a greater thing. D. H. Lawrence. No matter who you are, what you've accomplished, what your financial situation is, when you're dealing with a parent with Alzheimer's, you yourself feel helpless. The parent can't work, can't live alone, and is totally dependent, like a toddler. As the disease unfolds, you don't know what to expect. Maria Shriver. Gold and silver, like other commodities, have an intrinsic value, which is not arbitrary, but is dependent on their scarcity, the quantity of labor bestowed in procuring them, and the value of the capital employed in the mines which produce them. David Ricardo. Monetary policy should remain data dependent, be well communicated, and ensure that inflation expectations remain anchored. Geeta Gopinath. If there is anyone dependent on your income, parents, children, relatives, you need life insurance. Susie Orman. We are all dependent on one another, every soul of us on earth. George Bernard Shaw. I wish people would realize that animals are totally dependent on us, helpless, like children, a trust that is put upon us. James Herriot. Both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, are dependent on the same private interest groups for campaign funds, so both parties dance to the same masters. Paul Craig Roberts. Success is dependent upon the glands, sweat glands. Zig Ziglar. Why do we feel jealousy? Therapists often regard the demon as a scar of childhood trauma or a symptom of a psychological problem. And it's true that people who feel inadequate, insecure, or overly dependent tend to be more jealous than others. Helen Fisher. The original purpose of the welfare state was to lift people into self-sufficiency, not to create a permanent underclass dependent on taxpayers. Stephen Moore. I think the key to happiness is allowing ourselves to not feel bad or guilty for feeling it, and letting it be contagious. And to not be dependent on other people to create your own happiness. Brittany Murphy. I developed a sense of maturity when it comes to being dependent upon other people. I don't feel anyone really truly wants me to win more than I do. Shani Davis. We are a small, open economy, highly dependent on global flows. It is inevitably a demand that dramatically alters and that is reflected in what we feel here in New Zealand. So there is at its most basic level a limit to what we can do, and that is true everywhere. John Key. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. Karl Marx. Independence? That's middle-class blasphemy. We are all dependent on one another, every soul of us on earth. George Bernard Shaw. People without children do have the freedom to do things that caring parents with dependent kids can't, to work long hours, to travel frequently, to relocate, and to do all these things on short notice if necessary. In return, they can achieve positions that devoted parents can't. Virginia Postrel. We can't equate democracy with Christianity because the largest democracy on earth is India, which is primarily Hindu. The third largest democracy is Indonesia, which is Islamic. Democracy and freedom are not dependent on Christian beliefs. Jimmy Carter. As long as we're dependent on those fossil fuels, we're dependent on the Middle East. If we are not victims, we're certainly captives. John M. McHugh. There is no teacher, living or past, who can give us the actual understanding of truth. A teacher can only put our feet upon the path and point the way. That is all. It is wholly dependent on the individual to make his way to truth. Paul Twitchell. I grew up in Mexico City at a time when the country was a repressive one-party dictatorship almost wholly dependent on oil revenues. Brett Stevens. You must not lean on a tree on Sabbath, if the tree might be dependent on you for support. Ovadia Yosef. Our democracy is dependent on people who passionately cherish the ideals of a democracy. Every man is created equal with an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a wonderful idea, and it takes people who cherish that idea to be actively involved in the process. George Takei. It's very dependent on your state of mind. And your emotional state as well. And a lot of it comes pouring out, you don't really have that much control with it. Eric Clapton. A manufacturing nation is, in every sense of the word, dependent on others. Look to England. Cut off from the markets of the world, misery and ruin await her. John Tyler. The awareness that health is dependent upon habits that we control makes us the first generation in history that to a large extent determines its own destiny. Jimmy Carter. Men honor what lies within the sphere of their knowledge, but do not realize how dependent they are on what lies beyond it. Zhuangzi. Friendships, like marriages, are dependent on avoiding the unforgivable. John D. MacDonald.